In this episode, we're going to discuss corporate formation and governance. Topics that we'll cover include entity selection, whether you should take a look at a C-corp, S-corp, LLC, or partnership, the documents required to file your corporation and to keep it in good standing with the state and legally, as well as the corporate shield. What is it, why it's important, and how to keep it in place. And for this discussion, I've asked Erich Merrill Jr. of Miller Nash to join us, and he's graciously given up some time on a Friday afternoon to come in and sit down and discuss these topics and a few more. So if you're a business owner thinking of forming a new business, then stick around because this episode's for you. So I'm pleased to have with the channel Erich Merrill Jr., who's partner at Miller Nash. And Erich and I first met probably about 4 years ago.
Sounds
on
right.
A transaction we were working together. And I really appreciated Erich's approach to his clientele, which was obviously giving him great legal advice, but really educational, very calm. This was a fairly complex transaction, and Erich and his team just did a great job of walking through a very lengthy negotiation on the transaction. And so we've kept in touch ever since then, and so really appreciate you joining the channel today.
Oh, thank you, Brent. I appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah.
And glad to be able to pass along some thoughts.
Yeah. So as part of our series, we want to talk about corporate governance, corporate formation, and the different types of things that you should consider when forming a corporation, or if you have one already, to think about some of the things you may or may not be doing to keep yourself out of trouble, and that way you won't have to hire a great attorney like Erich here to get you out of that trouble. But anyway, with that, corporate formation. You know, there's different corporations. You got C, S-Corp, LLC, sole proprietor, but the sole purpose of that formation is to obviously form an entity, but have some protection with the owners.
Right, exactly. And one thing I often, a question I often get about forming an entity is, when do I need to do it? If you're starting up a business, for example, do you have to have a corporation formed the first day? And what I usually tell people is, if it's just going to be you for a while, you really don't have to form any kind of entity. The right time to do it, though, is before you hire your first employee. Because as long as it's just you don't escape liability by forming an entity, because you're the one doing everything, and you're the one who might be sued if there's a problem. As soon as you have that first employee, then there's another person who you're responsible for, and that's where you should form the corporate entity to get that protection that we'll talk about later.
Yeah, so when you're in that process, are there other things that you should think about as far as forming a corporation?
Well, one of the things that people need to think about is what kind of entity are they going to form?
Right.
And the choice that we see most people making these days is they usually start with an LLC. And that's not a bad choice. An LLC is an easy entity to form. It's very flexible. It has probably the lowest level of formality required.
Right.
And so a lot of people will start there, and that's fine. A corporate entity is also a good choice, but the answer really is, where are you, and sort of what are your plans for the business?
Right.
Let me expand on that a little bit more. An LLC is a great choice if you're going to probably just own the business yourself. You're not going to bring in outside investors, and you're not looking to have employees who will have some sort of equity interest in the company. If you're looking to any of those things I just mentioned, so you might want to bring in outside investors,
right,
or you want to have employees who are going to have, say, stock options,
right,
then a corporation is really probably the way you want to go. Corporations just work much better with stock options than an LLC does.
So what I see with businesses with enterprise values of 10 million or less is usually either an S corporation was formed immediately or an LLC was converted to an S corporation for tax purposes.
Right.
So in converting that to an S corp from an LLC, is there any difference between that and just a straight S corporation?
For tax purposes, the two are pretty similar.
Right.
If you know going in that you're going to elect to be taxed as an S corporation, I would generally advise go ahead and form the corporate entity.
Right.
Because otherwise you are kind of crossing two slightly different things. You're working under an LLC statute, but you've got to comply with the formalities for an S corporation. That's really not a problem, but it's just, I think it's cleaner if you just form an S corp from the
corporation.
beginning.
And then the biggest difference between S corp and a C corp, other than the double taxation?
That's really it, the double taxation.
Yeah.
With the S corp, so first of all, just to be clear for those who may be listening, there's only one kind of corporation from a corporate law sense. When we say S or C, what we're talking about is how that corporation elects to be taxed when it files its tax returns. So the two entities look exactly alike. They're both formed in the same way.
Right.
It's just a tax election.
Okay, perfect.
So that's really the difference in the two.
And I don't see 20 million or less. I see very few C corporations. And when I say 20 million,
Right.
I'm talking enterprise value. And it's really the election of especially just that tax purpose, just it's a one, an S
Exactly.
corporation, you're taxed as singly, double tax, corporate tax, and then a personal tax for the C corporation.
And you asked, and I probably didn't fully answer this, you asked if there were differences in the S Corp and C Corp. And the differences come about because of the restrictions imposed on an S Corp. So
Right.
for example, an S Corp is not going to be able to take money from a corporate investor because that's not allowed
Right.
by the S Corp
Right.
rules. So you can only have individuals as owners. You can't have someone who lives in Canada or Asia
Right, foreign
as
investors.
an investor.
Right.
So there are those restrictions. That's not anything to do with the actual corporate entity, but it is a restriction on how you may choose to fund and operate the entity that comes out of the S election.
Okay, so as a merger and acquisition advisor, and this is something that you and I have spent some time chatting about, usually the entity documents, especially when we're looking at selling the company, become really important, not only for their upkeep, but do you have them and have you enforce them? So maybe you could go through just the
Absolutely.
basic entity documents that are required and recommended to keep up to date, because I'm going to hammer this point home
Right.
the whole way through this video.
I will join you in talking about that. Our theme today should be documentation.
Yeah, right, yeah.
Documentation is key to all of this. So the basic documents, if you're going to form an entity or run a business in entity form, there are two kinds of documents. They're the formation documents and the operating documents.
Right.
The formation documents are pretty simple. They're going to be articles of incorporation for either an S or C corporation, or they're going to be articles of formation, or some states call them articles of organization for an LLC. That's a fairly simple document. It's filed with the state. It's public, and it really has minimal information in it, primarily the name of the entity and some key information about maybe who the managing group
Member
is going to
is,
be.
yeah.
So that's the main document for either type of entity. By the way, we're talking about two entities here, an LLC and a corporation. There are certainly others.
Right.
They're going to be outside the scope of what we're talking about today because
Yep.
most people don't get into using them. But those are the two. For the operating documents, in a corporation, this is where the bylaws come in, as well as a buy-sell agreement, which we'll talk about quite a bit.
Yeah.
In the LLC area, the main operating document is called, not surprisingly, an operating agreement. That's where that comes from. In some states, it's called an LLC agreement. But that is basically the contract between all the owners of the LLC as to key aspects of running the business.
Right. And that key aspects of running the business becomes really important, especially when you have a majority owner, majority-minority relationship.
Yes.
So having those responsibilities, duties, obligations, and rights put out in writing, and
Yes.
this is where I always
Yes.
say, in written documents with a contract law or buy-sell agreements or anything, the document and the words on the paper matter a ton. So pay critical attention, make sure it's crystal clear, and that all parties involved fully understand what those rights and obligations are. Keep you out of a lot of trouble.
People come to you and me, Brent, because typically they're looking to sell a business.
Right.
And I think you've already hinted at this, but I'll just say it again. A sale is going to be so much easier, so much cheaper, so much quicker if the company has done a good job all the way along of just keeping copies of the basic documentation, keeping it organized, having it easy to find so that when you go to sell the business, it's all there and the buyer asks for it and you can give it to them. That just makes a sale go so much quicker and so much faster.
Yeah. And then we'll talk a little bit about how you keep the corporate shield up is one of the big things, because I had a situation where represented the buyer in a transaction in the state of California. One of the first steps after acquiring the company in a stock purchase was to talk to his new corporate attorney, and we quickly found out that the corporate shield was down in a couple different areas. One in just their bookkeeping or keeping of their annual shareholder meetings, corporate resolutions, but also on the state register. And maybe you can speak to that a little bit.
So LLCs and corporations have to annually file a report with the state, typically pay a fee.
Right.
That's what the state wants out of you.
Yeah, they're doing it for free.
And it's easy to overlook that, particularly if you're running a business, you're not paying attention too much to the stuff that doesn't absolutely have to be done. The state will send you a reminder, but those are easy to overlook.
Right.
If you overlook them for, in Oregon, more than 45 days, then your entity is technically dissolved. And so you want to be really sure that you pay that annual fee, you file that annual report with the state each year so that your entity stays there and keeps providing that protection.
Right. I just filed mine. I got my
Good
notice.
job. Good job.
Got it last week. So
before we leave the corporate formation,
sure.
I want to talk about one more document that's very important that we haven't mentioned yet. And this is in the corporate side particularly. That's the stock ledger.
Yes.
Stock ledger
please.
is so key to indicating who it is that holds stock in a corporation. It is the official record of who the owners are. And you can bet that when you come to sell a business, the people buying that business are going to want to know that they've included all the owners in the deal documentation so that they don't buy a business and then later find out that Aunt Sally shows up and says, hey, by the way, I have 10% of what you just bought.
Right. So
that's critically important.
Yeah. So this gets down to organization. Usually put one person in charge of keeping your corporate books. But annual shareholder meetings, the proper notices to go out for the shareholder meetings, the corporate resolutions, make sure that you keep minutes, and this should be kept, both, I recommend both digitally and on paper, and that anybody that's a shareholder should have access to all of those all that documentation. When selling a business, I cannot tell you how many times we've had to go back and have attorneys restructure all this and go through this and spend $10,000 to $15,000 going back through records and recreating them. I sold a company last year, 30-year-old business, had gone through the original owner, sold to a secondary owner. Secondary owner's wife became an owner. She died, and there was no documentation to the transfer. So that caused
Yeah.
some problems. So just, from day one, I can't tell you how important it is to keep those records, keep them consistent. Now, and if you're an S-Corp, one of the things you get to do is you can go anywhere and hold that shareholder meeting. So if you want to take a vacation,
Right.
go to Hawaii, stay at the Hilton, and have a shareholder meeting, knock yourself off. You can write the whole thing off, but just have your shareholder meetings and make sure you keep track of that. And especially, like Erich said, stock ledger is really important. Especially, if it's just you or it's you and a business partner, you still got to keep track of it. But over a period of time with larger corporations, what I found is there are partners coming and going over the years. And it becomes really important. Corporate Shield. So
Corporate Shield.
what is it? Why do you keep? Why is it so important?
Let me answer that with an example. First, at a very high level, the Corporate Shield is protection against liability of the business. But an example is probably the best way to answer that question. Let's say that I go out and I form a medical products company.
Right.
And come out with a great product, hire some employees, I lease some office space, I lease some factory space, I go out to the bank, I borrow some money to fund the business and start manufacturing my product. I am lucky enough to find a major customer early on. That major customer starts buying. We've got a great business that's just cooking along. Now this business has been incorporated since day one, in my example. But then disaster strikes, which can happen in any business.
Right.
No matter how good you are, the customer decides to go to a competing product. Not only that, you get sued, or the business gets sued for patent infringement at the same time. So all of a sudden, your revenue goes to zero. You've got a landlord knocking on the door saying, "Where's my rent?" You've got a bank knocking on the door saying, "I need you to pay my loan." And you've got a plaintiff's lawyer who's holding up a judgment they just won against you for hundreds of thousands of dollars for patent infringement. Things are not looking good. This is where the Corporate Shield is critically important.
Right.
You as the owner can say, well, we gave it a try, dust off your hands and walk away. You will have lost the business. All the assets in that business are going to go to those creditors. But you won't lose your house. You won't lose your life savings. The bank, the landlord, and the plaintiff's attorneys are all going to have to just look at that business and not to you. So that's what a Corporate Shield is, and that's why it's important.
And that's why you keep all these records and have your shareholder meetings and file your corporate with the state on a regular basis, and don't be late. So it is really important.
In order for you to maintain the Corporate Shield or the liability shield, the court has to see that you, in fact, treated the business as being within a corporation or within an LLC. And so that's where maintaining all these documents is important.
Right.
So let's say you have a contract you're going to sign. You don't sign that contract in your name personally. You sign it corporate name, and then under that the word by, and then your signature, and then the title. You may be CEO. Why, what capacity are you signing this document in when you're signing it on behalf of the corporation?
Great point.
That is the kind of thing. Those are little details that are easy to do correctly. They're also get overlooked a lot, and they can be the key to maintaining the Corporate Shield. Same thing, you mentioned meetings. If you have an annual meeting of directors, keep minutes. If you don't have minutes of the meeting, it doesn't look like it happened.
Right.
Documentation is key.
Right. No, and I agree. So, so is there, in your estimation, is there any one entity that you recommend over another, or offer a better Corporate Shield than another?
Let me ask why you asked that.
Well, I just, because people sometimes think about what they should do, what gives them the best liability protection.
Okay.
And so really And nothing more than,
All right.
no other reason more than that.
So from a statutory standpoint, in other words, from the standpoint of the law that governs forming entities and the liability shield, there's no difference between an LLC and a corporation.
Okay.
Both are fine. The reason I wanted to know what you were asking about is, as a practical matter, it's probably a little bit easier to maintain the liability shield if you've got an LLC. And the reason for that is just because the requirements for formalities around an LLC are lower than they are for a corporation. So we just talked about minutes. In a corporation, you have to have annual shareholder meetings, annual director meetings, and you should keep minutes of those. In an LLC, meetings like that are not required. They're a good idea, and you probably want to do it every now and then just to kind of
At least
reset
year end.
the strategy, right?
Yeah.
But you're not required to. And so because there are fewer requirements for an LLC, it may be easier to maintain the corporate liability shield, but the degree of protection provided by the shield is really not any different.
Yeah.
So
okay.
I hope that
No.
maybe goes to some of the...
Corporate formation and governance. As you can tell, it's a fairly lengthy subject, so lengthy that this is the first episode of 2. So in this episode, Eric and I talked about entity selections, the documents required for you to file and keep update for your corporation, and then the importance of the corporate shield. Now in this next episode, Eric and I are going to discuss when it's time to sell, why all of the work that you've done up front become ultimately very important in the sale of a company. We're also going to discuss the Corporate Transparency Act of 2020, which became effective January 1st of 2024, and what it means to anybody that's forming a corporation this year or had one in the years past. As well as we're going to talk about the operating and the bylaws and partnership agreements that are really important to the smooth running and day-to-day operations of a corporation. So I hope you enjoyed this episode, and again I want to thank Eric for taking the time to come and discuss corporate formations and governance.